Hi people, hope you're all well. Before I get into the main subject here, just briefly to touch on another story which I covered in uh, the death of a teenager in London recently and my thoughts on the drill subculture, which I think is toxic. And I think this reiterates it. I'm reading from the Sun, January the 10th. Young guy who was killed, and this is the report. The piece is by Daniel Hammond. Sick rap lyrics have been posted online boasting of the murder of a boy of 14, as his mum told of trying to free him from the clutches of gang life. Kellyan Bazaka, who rapped under the name Gripper, was stabbed on a bus on Tuesday. He had been caught up in the grim postcode war in Woolwich, South East London. Hundreds of tributes were posted on Instagram after his death, while also written online were the lyrics Caught Gripper lacking on the 472, that's the bus. Laid in my coat, it's do or die. He tried jumping off, but the doors don't slide, ha. Now he's sitting there stiff with the fear in his eyes. Now this just proves my point that within gang culture you have the subculture of so-called real music that directly fuels gang rivalries. And in this case, they're gloating of the death of this young guy. And, people can interpret this how they will, but I've no doubt he would have been posting similar lyrics if a rival gang member had been killed. This is the elephant in the room. Now, it's not my position that if you get rid of drill music, you get rid of gang violence. Of course not. Um, but it sort of relates to the wider issue of what I'm talking about in this video, which is how political correctness should never ever get in the way of public safety. And in the case of the drill thing, political correctness would be, oh, you can't say that because it's predominantly black rappers. Well, so long as young black men are killing each other in the capital, we have to have an honest discussion about some of the things behind that. And one of them is how this so called music directly fuels the violence because it names rival gang members. It gloats about deaths. It directly fuels the postcode wars. And it's not the only thing, of course, it's not. Access to knives obviously is one. Now you can't ban kitchen knives, that goes without saying, but certainly there are knives out there that should not be in the hands of anyone, so called zombie knives. These are evil, menacing weapons that have no place in anything other than maybe a film set. Um, so there's other aspects to consider, but I just wanted to mention that because I think it underlies the point I was making. Now, the main thing I want to talk about in this video is the grooming gangs, and actually that's almost a euphemism because let's call them what they were, rape gangs. I'm just going to read out another report from the Sun, and this is also from the 10th of January. The term Asian grooming gangs would fall foul of an official definition of Islamophobia being pondered by the government. As a party, Labour has already internally adopted a document declaring the term as a modern version of age-old stereotypes about Islam and puts Muslims at risk of hate crimes. But the definition from a 2018 report by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims could also be extended across the civil service. The government said we are committed to tackling hatred in all its forms. Tory leader Kemi Badenoch said this is exactly why people are scared to tell the truth, and she's right. You'd think the left had learned nothing from this. Now, there's a few things to pick apart there. By the way, there was no reporter attached to the byline there. It may have been by, well, I don't know. It's Ryan Sebi is connected to the previous piece of Musk at the top of Starmer, so he may have done that report as well. The Sun obviously is against that position. So am I. Um, it's true that the generic Asian grooming gangs it is a little bit vague because they were specifically British Pakistani gangs. They weren't British Indian. They weren't British Bangladeshi or British Sri Lankan. They were British Pakistani gangs. That would be more accurate. But this idea of taping it into Islamophobia is strange to say the least. I mean, for one thing, Muslims cross a wide spectrum. You get Nigerian Muslims, you get white Muslims, you get Muslims from various backgrounds. So I don't know how the government um, can conclude that talking about Asian grooming gangs is the same as Islamophobia. It's nonsense. Um, but I do want to talk specifically about the political correctness around this. Even now, the left aren't getting it. They're talking about how it's itching to the far right to talk about this problem. There was a heated debate, caught part of it, between Piers Morgan and the commentator Mehdi Hassan. What I know of Mehdi Hassan is he has long been basically a mouthpiece to try and silence criticism of Islamic extremism. Um, whenever that issue has been discussed, he has been one of the main proponents of this narrative of Islamophobia. He's contributed to Al Jazeera, which is no surprise, but I take a very thin cue of Mr. Hassan because I think he's one of the most vocal people out there who is trying to silence legitimate debate. Now, Hassan said, of course, it's outrageous what these gangs done, but why don't we talk about white grooming gangs in Glasgow or Cornwall? Morgan retorted that we were talking specifically about the crimes in Rochdale and Rotherham and other towns. Now, Hassan didn't deny that they were predominantly British Asians in those situations. He didn't deny that. And of course, he made the token, it's awful, the terrible crimes, etc., as any sane thinking person would. No one with any brain is going to try and defend these gangs. But the problem with Mehdi Hassan's position is it's pushing the false narrative that if you talk about the gangs, that's racist in of itself. Um, the thing is, absolutely nobody is saying that there aren't white predators. That's a false narrative. No one has claimed that. No one has said that there are not white predators out there. I caught a debate in the Metro newspaper, and one young guy who said he was a Muslim student said he felt stigmatized and he felt that he was being targeted because of this. Well, I have sympathy for anyone who gets tarred with the same brush. I have sympathy with anyone who has to put up with ignorant abuse because of their faith or because of their ethnic background. That's wrong, obviously. But I don't think that is enough to say, well, we can't talk about the problem. Um, because the fact of the matter is, in those towns, there was a specific problem. They were overwhelmingly British Pakistani men. Saying that is not the same as generalizing all British Pakistani men. It's not the same as saying, oh, they're all predators. And this is what the left don't get. They're so wrapped up in sensitivity and political correctness that they won't just acknowledge the truth. I've come across left wing people saying, oh, predators are all races. You can't say it's just British Asians. But no one is saying it's just British Asians. So it's a false narrative to claim that that is what's happening. It's not what's happening. Um, and here's the problem. If we can't have an open debate about this, if we can't openly talk about the issue, then how do you address it? How do you prevent it from happening again? Because these gang members can just themselves use the race card. It's utterly infuriating. I think do need to be extremely, extremely wary of any legal definitions of Islamophobia because it could effectively end up being a de facto blasphemy law. What I mean by that is there's no equivalent laws on Christian phobia or anti-Sikh attitudes or anti-Hindu attitudes or anti-Jewish attitudes, although probably with the rise in anti-Semitic attacks, that will also be a work in progress as to how that's defined. But I think with any religion, frankly, there has to be a differentiation between people's right to criticize a religion and religious doctrine versus just hating adherents of that religion. Now, I do happen to think that if someone is spouting out hatred of Muslims in general, um, that probably should be looked into because that would be inflaming social tensions. If you're going out spouting out bile against all Muslims, that I wouldn't support that. I don't think that is. I think that is an abuse of free speech because it's an entire group that you're attacking. But if someone says they think that Islam has a tolerance problem, that it has a violence problem, and I would argue it absolutely does. I think people should absolutely have the freedom to say that. I think ex-Muslims should be protected from harassment and violence because they have been threatened. You know, why the focus on protecting Muslims? You should also be focused on protecting ex-Muslims. Um, so I would definitely scrutinise this government over any moves that they try to legislate on this. And I hope the Tories and Reform and the Liberal Democrats, if they have any backbone, and if they truly are liberal, would push back against this. You know, I don't say that there should be no legislation whatsoever to tackle hate. I think, you know, we can't pretend that there isn't hate crime out there. There is. But it has to be a real balancing act between saying this is hate targeted by the way an individual looks versus simply someone disliking a religion. Now, let me give an example. If you have some Muslims leaving a mosque, minding their own business, and you get some louts yelling abuse at them, I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think anyone should have to put up with that. But likewise, if you get an ex-Muslim who is saying this is their experience, they shouldn't have to put up with abuse from Islamists either. And Labour, frankly, lacks courage in this regard. You know, where was Keir Starmer and other leading Labour figures when a teacher was forced into hiding because he was accused of blasphemy, accused of insulting the Prophet? That is absolutely disgraceful that that would happen in this country. I remember when the Pakistani Christian woman, Asia Bibi, was trying to get refuge in Europe. At the time, the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, said she couldn't guarantee her safety in this country because of the threat of Islamist violence. It is pathetic that every time these things are spoken about, the left get into this knee-jerk attitude of you're pandering to the far right. Now, the way I would look at that is, yeah, the far right is a problem, and I'm not someone who denies that there is blood and soil nationalists out there. There are people who are quite dangerous, the likes of National Action, Combat 18, Patriotic Alternative. They are people who I would have absolutely nothing to do with. I think they are potentially dangerous. But just because they are a problem doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about these issues. The fact that they might talk about them as well is, you know, they're going to be. I mean, what I would say to people is don't trust the far right because, you know, Islamist extremism is a convenient excuse for them. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, they would have been harassing Asian and Jewish shopkeepers. Far right has always been a problem going back to Oswald Mosley's black shirts. So I don't really accept this argument that they somehow have legitimacy because they happen to be right about Islamism. And it shouldn't be this perverse competition between Islamists and the far right. My problem with this Labour government, you know, Starmer says as head of the CPS, he prosecuted terrorists and he was tough on crime. That may be true, but language also matters. And the fact of the matter is, Keir Starmer has a track record of putting woke virtue signalling um, above common sense when he took the knee for Black Lives Matter. Um, and so far as Prime Minister, I haven't heard Keir Starmer utter the word Islamist extremism, not once. I'm not saying that he hasn't, I just haven't seen it. I'd love to be proven wrong on that. I really, really would, because I think it's important that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has the honesty to say this is a problem. Say what you want about Emmanuel Macron, but Macron, to his credit, has vocally spoken out about Islamic extremism. In this country, um, even Tory leaders have been more reluctant. Why? It's a problem. Now, Islamic extremism as it pertains to Islamist violence isn't necessarily the same as the rape gangs. Within that, there is a racism issue because they saw their victims, predominantly young white girls, as cheap, you know, and that's why they were targeted. I think that the irony about this, the irony of the attitude the left is taking, is it's precisely what prevented justice being done in the first place because the authorities failed to act, lest they be seen as racist. Um, in fact, since we're on the subject, I'll just get a piece in the Daily Mail. Apologies, I really should have had this on standby, but it's important. Um, One of the first people to expose the grooming rape gangs was had an interesting piece here about the attitude that the left has taken. regarding grooming gangs. Just bear with me a second. Yeah, Sue Reed. Um, she was the first writer to expose the grooming gangs back, I believe, actually way back in 1997. Now, this is how far this goes back, and it's another reason I'm skeptical of a certain South African billionaire. I won't name him, but why is he jumping on the bandwagon now? But this is what Sue Reed writes. I was the first writer to expose the grooming gangs and had racist scum daubed outside my house. Only a national inquiry will expose the extent of the cover up I witnessed. Now, I had mixed views on the idea of a national inquiry as I thought the right was jumping on a bandwagon, but maybe there should be. And maybe, I mean, it shouldn't be a blame game of just blaming it all on Labour. I think that successive governments have failed these victims. There's another thing I'd like to mention. I've heard people say, that politicians are playing football with us by pointing fingers. There's truth in that. However, I think talking about it isn't the same as, playing football with the issue. We have to talk about it. So I wouldn't necessarily blame conservative politicians for mentioning this issue. It's fair to ask, well, did you take the same position when you were in power? But it shouldn't be just presented as a blame game. Debate is important, actually. Um, and of course, the victims are important. I saw a piece in one of the papers, I can't remember which paper, but it was argued that we should take a continental approach where the focus is on the victims and not attacking the perpetrators. Well, really, it should be both. Absolutely, there needs to be help for the victims, but the perpetrators' culture that inspired this should be discussed because there's a racist attitude there where uh, British Pakistani men looked down on them. There was a racist attitude there. Most of the victims were white girls. There were one or two Asian victims as well, but there was a racist component to that. Um, I think the difference with the white gangs in other places is the victims were also white, so there wasn't that racist component in the same way. But there were other attitudes at play here. The authorities, I think, also saw these girls as difficult. And I think there was also snobbery at play. That also has to be considered. So yes, there was political correctness, but there was also an attitude from, frankly, the police and other authority figures who didn't take these girls seriously. And it's the old lesson. It's the old problem. It's the same with the victims of Jimmy Savile. They were just seen as troublemakers. I think one of the problems was the girls themselves were in a difficult position. They'd been committing petty crime because the gangs forced them to, for instance, shoplifting and so on. So, in that sense, they probably weren't deemed to be reliable witnesses. But when you have a young girl, 12 years old, 13 years old, trying to say that she is in this situation, she absolutely needs to be listened to. It's a horrendous thing if these girls were forced into a situation where they had to commit crime, which then it was probably a very evil, manipulative way for the gangs to evade detection as well. I mentioned the racist component um, in terms of their action to the girls, but also the fear of racism from the authorities. But I think getting the girls involved in petty crime put them in a very difficult position. Um, if I were a judge in one of those cases and a young girl was brought before me accused of shoplifting, if it was revealed that this was the component behind it, I would definitely show significant leniency, and I would say the gang is, they're the source, they're the ones who should be in the dock. So, in conclusion, the left, right now it's infuriating that they're saying, oh, you're pandering to the far right. I think Starmer has handled this badly, and Yvette Cooper and other Labour figures by accusing the Tories of pandering to the far right. I mean, they say they're not victim blaming, and it's true that they're not talking about the victims, but the very fact that they're using this term pandering to the far right, it shows that they're taking that more seriously than they are the actual crimes themselves. It may be that some conservatives are jumping on the bandwagon. Frankly, that is secondary to the gravity of these crimes. Um, so the left haven't learned a thing. If if their foremost attitude is to talk about the far right and to talk about how we can't say that about Asian grooming gangs, they're just not getting it. No one is saying that all British Pakistani men are guilty. Most British Pakistani men are law abiding citizens who are as disgusted as the rest of us. In fact, to their credit, two prominent British Pakistani men, Sajid Javid and Majid Nawaz, spoke out on this, years ago when it wasn't popular to do so. And they were kind of denounced by other left-wing British Asians saying, "Oh, you're just telling the far right what they want to hear." We have to stop this attitude whereby every time people talk about a problem, they're accused of pandering to the far right. Far right do get oxygen when these problems are ignored. That's the irony. It's the left's attitude to the problem that is actually fueling the far right, not conservatives and centrists talking about it. That's the irony about it. So I hadn't intended this one to be so long, but the issues are very important. The left haven't learnt a damn thing. They need to stop saying you're pandering to the far right. They need to stop presenting this false narrative that somehow, by talking about Asian grooming gangs, somehow vilifying all British Asian men. It's not doing that. And also, any legal drives to formally designate Islamophobia as a hate crime, I have a big problem with that. I would be okay with saying it's anti-Muslim hate crime, but Islamophobia is a very contentious term. It is often used to silence legitimate debate about Islamic extremism, of which we have a very serious problem in this country. I'd like Keir Starmer to get a bit more of a backbone on this issue. And it's all very, he can say he was tough on crime, he prosecuted terrorists and all the rest of it. But if he is not willing to use the sort of terms that need to be used, such as Islamic extremism, then he's just being a typical leftist in that sense by being putting political correctness over public safety, and it's an absolute disgrace.